Several years ago, some friends of mine were raving about a particular retail store that they had shopped in that had a 100% satisfaction guaranteed promise that was unlike all other 100% guaranteed satisfaction guaranteed promise. And so they talked about it in such terms that it was hard to miss, it was hard to not remember. They drew attention to the special nature of this, and so there came a moment where I had a chance to buy a product that could have been bought at that store, and so I did. I shopped and I bought a nice pair of hiking boots, and they were comfortable, they were durable. I wore them all the time. They were also waterproof, supposedly. And so, but I went like a couple years without ever testing them in any kind of moisture to see whether this was true or not true. But a couple years into having them, I was outside in some sort of a creek kind of area, shallow enough water that it was in no way coming in over the top of the boot. It was just simply the sides of the boot were not water resistant like they were supposed to. So I was surprised when my feet got wet. And I thought, well, that's a bummer. These were supposed to be waterproof. And I even looked at them a little more closely to say, well, did I remember that wrong? And then I saw on the side of the boot, indeed, waterproof. Well, as soon as that happened, I remembered that I'd purchased these from a place that hangs its hat on 100% satisfaction guaranteed. It's a promise. And I thought, I almost feel guilty thinking this, but I'm going to try to take them back. I'm going to try to take them back. This isn't like I had them for a week. I had them for 2 months. This is 2+ years. I took them into the store, and I kind of sheepishly put them on the counter. They are definitely not new any longer. And I explained that, hey, these I bought here, been a minute. You probably have record of it. You can look it up. But they're supposed to be waterproof, and they're not. So she said, oh, I'm sorry. And so she looked it up and said, actually, yes, that they should have been, and we are going to cover it. Upstairs, I just looked up. They have this exact same boot in the same size available right here. So you just leave this pair here, and you go upstairs and you grab that new pair, bring it down, and we'll do the exchange. I thought, this is unbelievable. This is unbelievable. A couple years after I bought them, they're going to give me a brand new pair. So I go get the new pair. I bring them down, and the lady remembers me when I get to the counter. She puts my old pair next to these, and then she starts typing away, doing what you do for a return. Nothing out of the ordinary. This just seems like normal process. But then as she starts to do some things, the cash register makes some noise, and it pops out, and she grabs a little bit out, and she hands it to me. And I go, whoa, wait. I thought we were going to do a, exchange here. Oh, no, we are. But those boots today are on sale. So they cost less than what you paid for when you bought them. So here's the difference back. I stood there dumbfounded. Embarrassed that I even asked for a return in the first place, but then dumbfounded that they actually not only returned them, but gave me money back. Now, that was the epitome of a promise kept, and it left a mark with me. And on the other side of that, I've continued to buy products from that particular retail store because of that day, because now I have a history, a well of trust that's been deepened in the promise that they speak. That promise kept made all the difference. Last week, we opened up the story of Abraham. Old Testament starts in Genesis chapter 12, and we said this is one of the most important characters in the entire Bible outside of Jesus. To understand Abraham and his story is to understand the big picture of the Bible. It's to understand why Jesus came and what he came to do. It's to understand the big picture of God's intervention in human history and how that comes to pass in our lives. But last week, we opened up by looking at a promise that God spoke to a 75-year-old man named Abraham and his wife Sarah when he said to this couple who had never been able to conceive, Abraham, I'm going to make you into a great nation. From you, all the people of the earth will be blessed. Last week, we looked at Genesis 12. We're going to be in chapter 15 today. Nearly 10 years have taken place between these 3 chapters. And in those 3 chapters, in those 10 years, approximately 0 has happened to make what God said actually come to pass. 10 years down the road, God said and promised, I'm going to make you a great nation. 10 years later, there's nothing to show for it. Nothing at all to show for it. And so Abraham, at this point, starts to get a little itchy and scratchy in his faith. And it's fair, right? I mean, like we just do. This is what happens. There's this huge gap between what God said and what is reality. And it's disorienting. We use the theme for this series called Uncharted because I think it's a great picture of an adventure of someone being called into a journey of faith but not knowing where it's going. Abraham is living in uncharted reality, and this season is very disorienting for him. It's disorienting because the landscape that he's living life under does not match at all the prophecy that was spoken over his life. And when that happens, we start to get a little bit itchy and scratchy. Like maybe more specifically, fear starts to rise. Because there starts to have this doubt that maybe what was said isn't actually going to come true, and maybe I was a fool to believe it. Or maybe it's not going to happen the way I thought it was going to happen. And so fear starts to rise. The other thing that starts to rise is dumb. Dumb just starts rising. And people, when they're waiting for God to do something he said he was going to do, but he's not done it yet, start getting impatient, and they start getting weak in moments, and they start doing dumb stuff. We're going to see that happen later in Abraham's life, where he kind of takes some matters into his own hands because he just can't simply wait for what God is going to do ultimately in his life. So God in Genesis chapter 15, I guess, realizes that, all right, it's been a long time. It's time for me to restate this promise over his life because I need him to be encouraged. And so Genesis chapter 15, verse 1, it says, after this, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision. Don't be afraid, Abram. I am your shield, your very great reward. But Abram said, Sovereign Lord, what can I do? What can you give me since I remain childless, and the one who will inherit my estate is Eleazar of Damascus? Abram said, you've given me no children, so a servant in my household will be my heir. Abraham is honest here. He's just straight up honest. He's like, you said this was going to happen. It's not happening. And this isn't getting easier to believe. It's getting harder to believe. It's another way of saying, God, I just don't see it. Like when you said this 10 years ago when I was 75, that we would have a kid, that seemed crazy then. 10 years later, this is not getting easier to believe. Like biology is working against us. I'm getting older. Sarah has always been barren. Time is running out. Verse 4, then the word of the Lord came to him. This man will not be your heir, but a son who is your own flesh and blood will be your heir. He took him outside, then he said, look up at the sky and count the stars, if indeed you can count them. And then he said to him, so shall your offspring be. And Abram believed the Lord, and he credited it to him as righteous. As I said earlier, the thing about Abraham that's so powerful is when you get into his story, you start to understand a lot of the Bible and a lot of the big picture, the story arc and where this whole thing is going. Things that show up in Abraham's story in a small way become magnified in a huge way in the person of Jesus later. And that's why this story is so important to unpack and to understand. It's written by Moses. Abraham's account is written by Moses, like 400-ish years later after this event happened. He would write this down, Genesis. Of course, he'd write down Exodus. He would have so much retrospect and the ability to look back in hindsight and start charting and writing down. Here's how the story of God has been unfolding in these early years of human history. There's a lot of things that he would be able to put together with hindsight that Abraham wouldn't be able to see. For that matter, there's a lot of things about Moses' life that we can put together with hindsight that he wouldn't have been able to see. What I love about Abraham's story is that it's kind of universal in its application. Yes, it has connection to Jesus. Yes, it also has connection to the faith journey of everybody. Because in some ways, we could say that every faith journey is an uncharted journey. Your life is your life. You're walking a new path that nobody else has walked before and nobody else will walk again. And so as such, there's a lot of takeaways in Abraham's story along with the connection to Jesus, that just seem to find us when we are living life in our uncharted places. Here, God is assuring Abraham and us that even when the promise doesn't look like it's being fulfilled in the way or timeline that we want it to happen, that rough terrain does not cancel God's promise. Just because this is getting difficult, just because this is hard, just because the terrain is rough, it doesn't cancel it. It doesn't cancel his promise. His promise is still good even when the terrain of life seems to contradict what he says. That's hard to grasp. Maybe that's even where you find yourself now, as you find yourself in a season that's a little rougher. And while you know certain things to be true about God, in your experience, you're battling. Like you know that God says, I will never leave you or forsake you. But if you're honest, right now you feel alone. You know that, like God told Jeremiah, I have a plan for your life, a plan to grow you, a plan to prosper you. But if you are honest, you feel stuck. You know that God says, I am faithful, but you're getting weary that the breakthrough has not happened yet. Maybe even wondering, why would God allow this tension? This is one of the questions I have with God a lot. Like, if you've spoken it and it's true, why so hard? And why is this taking so long? Why does this tension have to exist? Why can't you just snap your fingers and we move from conflict to resolution, God? That's what life in the uncharted asks of us. It exposes us. It exposes human limitation, and I think that's exactly the point. As you look at Abraham's story, when this whole thing starts to come together, there's no way anybody looks at Abraham and goes, man, what a guy. Nobody looks at Abraham, what a stallion, just an absolute stud. That Abraham, I want to be like Abraham. That's not the way the story goes. It's so absurd, and it's so difficult, and it takes so long that everybody instead goes, wow, look at God. He is so faithful. He is so faithful. If Abraham could have produced the promise on his own, he wouldn't need God. So uncharted territory then is where self-sufficiency comes to die. Because it's in uncharted territory of faith that you start to realize that you have limits. You start to realize that you can't force outcomes and you can't manufacture miracles and you can't hurry God. And that's hard, but the good news is that uncharted territory doesn't just highlight your limitations, it also magnifies God's power. It allows you to have a chance and set the stage for what he could ultimately do. Look at verse 5 again. God takes takes Abram outside. And he says, look up at the sky and count the stars if you can indeed count them. And he says to him, so shall your offspring be. This is a big deal here. God doesn't argue with Abraham. He doesn't. What he does is he reframes his perspective. Abraham is looking at his limitations. And God says, let me put your eyes somewhere else. Why don't you look up? I don't know if you've noticed this or not, but it tends to be that what we fix our eyes on and what we stare at shapes what we believe about a situation. Abraham was looking down at himself and his hope was melting. God invites him to look up at the stars where faith could arise. God, instead of arguing with Abram when he says, here's how to count my limitations, God, here's all the reasons why this will never work, God says, why don't you count the stars? If Abraham stares at his body, hope dies. But if he stares at the stars, faith rises. Likewise, if you stare at a health scare or a diagnosis and you fixate on that, you will find hope dissolving. If you stare or fix your eyes at your employment status, especially if it's not what you want it to be, and that's where you fix your eyes constantly, your hope will die. If you stare at your strained relationship, and over every day, all you think about, all you see, all your eyes are fixed on is the failures and the frustrations, hope will die. You stare at your bills that are stacking up, hope dies. But if you fix your gaze on God, faith rises. And sometimes I think God has to take us outside of our fear, outside of our logic, outside of our mistakes, outside of our timeline, and remind us how big he is. Because in this moment, Abraham was saying, God, I can't. And it was there God said, you're right, but I can't. So fix your eyes on the greatness and on the power of who God is. He's saying to Abraham, yes, I realize that this is going rougher than you want. But it hasn't changed one thing for me and what I'm committed to do. And guys, if I'm honest, this has got to be probably one of the hardest things in faith, is to embrace this. Because when it goes rough, we tend to take this approach with God that somehow this must be invalidating what you said to be true about my life. Somehow my experience and my suffering must then be related to God in such a way that he is not carrying through with what he said he would do. When in reality, it hasn't changed one thing for him and what he's committed to do. The rough experiences of life don't cancel out the promises of God. What he said he will do, he will do. That means that even when it doesn't go according to the timeline that I want, that delays don't weaken the promise. And if it's not for rough terrain, it's delay that ends up getting us, guys. Both are part of the story, but like if you could hold on through a rough moment or two, it's the challenge of time. The longer the delay, the stronger the doubt. But delay doesn't mean that God forgot or that the promise has expired. I think in God's wisdom, he realized that the delay actually deepens the dependence. It deepens the dependence. If the promise could have come immediately, Abraham wouldn't have matured. And so his waiting was stretching his faith and stretching his trust. And here's the thing, God would rather grow your faith than rush your comfort. I pray to God, honestly, I pray to God like he would rather rush my comfort. Do you pray to God like that? Like, surely, God, you would rather rush my comfort and you would rather just pick this all up and put this back together. He is not as interested as I am in rushing my comfort. He's interested in growing my faith. That's what he was doing with Abram in this moment. And his response was appropriate. Verse 6, Abram believed the Lord and he credited it to him as righteousness. This moment, this verse becomes a big verse in the Bible. The moment that Abraham believes and it is credited to him as righteousness. It becomes something that the Apostle Paul will reflect back on in books like Romans, to describe Galatians, to describe what faith in God, saving faith, looks like. And it's the kind of faith that precedes any kind of clarity on where this story is going. It's the kind of faith that's not tied on outcomes and results. Notice that Abram is told that his faith is credited as righteousness before the nation is built, before Isaac is born, before anything actually even comes to pass. No evidence, no proof. He believed. And God counted his trust as righteousness. Not his perfection, not his performance, but his trust. In this uncharted season, God was calling him to put down roots, the fruit of which he may not see for a long time. Sometimes in these seasons, God invites us to pray and to believe. And even in the waiting, when we're tempted to believe that heaven's doors have been closed up and the airwaves have been shut down and God is not listening because he's not replying, that actually nothing has changed about his promise. And that in his time, it'll still come true. Like a seed growing underground long before they break through the surface. You plant something today, you go dig it back up, look tomorrow, it'll look like nothing happened. That doesn't mean nothing happened. It means there's a process of growing that you can't see just yet. This was a moment where God was calling Abraham into himself, not into Abraham, into God. Because the power is in him, not in you. And he used this as an example, maybe the first example in Abram's life, to be able to retroactively look backwards and start to see this was always promised and always planned from the beginning. So that it could become a well of trust and faith that could be drawn on not just by Abraham, but by everybody who would follow in that same path, so that they would come to believe the same thing that Abram would ultimately come to believe, and that's that God always secures his promise in his time, in his power. In his time and in his power. Whenever somebody makes a promise, what they are doing, in effect, is they are looking forward, reaching out into a future, and putting a guarantee out there that they will fulfill what they said they would fulfill. Every promise we speak, that's what we do. Sometimes we know when the promise will be fulfilled. I promise you by Friday. And then sometimes the promise is more general. When a husband and wife stand up here on a stage and they say, I do, they make a promise, that's a promise that reaches into the future in ways that they may not be able to see in that moment. And the promise is that whenever the crisis comes up, whenever the moment comes up, whenever the doubt comes up, whenever the struggle comes up, whenever the difficulty, I promise you, in that moment in the future, you'll find me there. I'll be there. We may not know when it is. We can't control what that future date is, but I can control this. I'll be there. I can control that I will connect to you. That's what God's about to do with Abraham. He's about to do something that will forever cement a promise. And what I mean by that is he makes a covenant with him. Covenant. Huge moment is about to unfold. Because it's one thing for God to just say, I promise you. It's another thing for him to make a covenant the way he does. He tells Abram, listen, go get a heifer, a goat, a ram, a dove, and a young pigeon. I need you to butcher each of these, and the bigger animals I need you to cut in half, and I need you to lay them on either side and create a walkway between them. Now, for us today, this is weird. This just seems really, really strange. But in the ancient day, this was how covenants were made. And there was a sobriety to the moment. I mean, there was something very solemn and very, very committed to it. Because effectively, by having these animals sacrificed, laying in two halves on either side and walking down between them, each party would walk. What was happening was you were committing in a way that you said, if I don't commit, or if I don't keep the commitment, may what's happened to these animals happen to me. That's the symbolism in it. That if I don't follow through, may what happened to them happen to me. Like this is a blood oath, a life for life agreement. Here's where it gets real interesting. In verse 12, as the sun was setting, Abram fell into a deep sleep, and a thick and dreadful darkness came over him. And then the Lord said to him, know for certain that for 400 years your descendants will be strangers in a country not their own, and that they will be enslaved and mistreated there. But I will punish the nation they serve as slaves, and afterward they will come out with great possessions. That is a prediction of the next book in the Bible, Exodus, and exactly what happens. You, however, will go with your ancestors in peace and be buried at a good old age, and in the 4th generation your descendants will come back here, for the sin of the Amorites has not yet reached its full measure. When the sun had set and the darkness had fallen, a smoking firepot with a blazing torch appeared and passed between the pieces. And on that day, the Lord made a covenant with Abram. Those last words are super important. On that day, the Lord made a covenant with Abram. Abram never walked the pieces. Abram fell into a deep sleep while this was going on and was watching this in a hazy, groggy manner. God alone made the covenant, as represented by the smoking fire pot and the blazing torch. These are both Old Testament symbols of his presence. By doing it this way, what God is saying is this: Abram, this promise, this covenant ultimately does not depend on you. It ultimately depends on me. Not on your performance, but on my performance. The other thing that this is a symbolic picture of is the fact that, Abraham, if you don't fulfill your end of this, the punishment does not fall on you, but on me. That's why he went alone. That's why he made this covenant by himself. It's on me to make this happen, not on you. It's one-sided. God binds himself to the promise. He takes responsibility. He assumes the consequences, and 2,000 years later, he does exactly that. Because the promise to Abraham was never simply about land or descendants. It was about blessing all the people of the earth through his son, Jesus. Because through Abraham came Isaac, through Isaac came Jacob, through Jacob came Israel, through Israel came Jesus, and through Jesus came salvation. To all people, for all time. And at the cross, the covenant blood was not animal blood, but the blood of Jesus. And on that hill, God walked not between the pieces, but was torn to pieces. Suspended between heaven and earth. And on that cross, God absorbed the cost of the covenant. Death. He took the penalty for every broken promise, every failed obedience, every human limitation. What I'm saying, guys, is that that covenant that was established with Abraham in Genesis 15 finds its ultimate fulfillment at Calvary, where Jesus was crucified. The smoking fire pot was replaced by a crown of thorns, and the blazing torch becomes pierced hands. And the God who passed through the pieces becomes the Savior who passes through death. And here's the beauty. Just like Abraham was asleep when God made his covenant, and the promise rested on God's faithfulness, not Abraham's perfection, so your salvation rests the same way. Not on how well you perform, not on how strong your faith feels. This is typically what we try to do because, again, Abram was made righteous. Guys, that's the Bible's end game for all of us to be able to be with heaven. We have to be declared righteous. The problem is that no, not one of us is. And so we could try as we may, but our best efforts are still not going to make us in. So our only shot is for God to make a way where there's not a way. Because contrary to popular belief, we don't make it into heaven or be declared righteous if we have more on the good deeds scoreboard than the bad deeds scoreboard. We don't make it into heaven. We don't get declared righteous if we're a little better than somebody else. Some of us look at other people and they go, well, God must have mercy on me because I'm not as bad as him. I'm not as bad as her. Neither qualifies you for making it into heaven in relationship with God. You have to be declared righteous to make it in. So what Jesus did, which is symbolized in what happened with Abraham, walking through these pieces and this covenant established, is he said, I will take the punishment that your unfaithfulness deserves. And I will establish as a grace and a gift to you a righteousness that you could not earn. You can't buy it, you can't earn it, you can't work for it, but I will give it to you because I love you. Because I love you. And so if you ask this question, God, why do you keep putting up with me? Why? The answer is this: because he promised he would. He promised he would. It's as simple as that. He's a promise-keeping God. And when he says it will happen in his time and in his power, it will happen. So when the terrain contradicts the promise, and when the delay feels like a denial, When the uncharted seasons stretch your trust, remember this, that the God who made the promise is the God who sealed it with his own blood. And if he was faithful enough to go to the cross, he's faithful enough to finish what he started in your life. That means today, there are real life steps of faith for you to take. Maybe for the very first time, to step into that uncharted space with Jesus and to say, I surrender to you, to your will for my life. I'm no longer going to be following the chart or the map of the world. I'm not going to be following any longer my own desires, but I will surrender to you because you have made a covenant with me that I could never have deserved. You've covered me with your love. You've covered me with your grace. This is an invitation to place your faith in Jesus. Like Abraham was invited to place his faith in God, to place, not knowing where this was going, not knowing all the details, but knowing enough with certainty that God had spoken a promise and allowing that to be enough to propel his first steps forward. His faith changed everything about his life from this moment forward, just like it can for you. If you've never personally placed your faith in Jesus, it starts with just that cry from the heart where you realize, I am broken without him, helpless without him. But it moves forward towards a more public declaration. There's internal work where you're believing and trusting that what God did by sending his son Jesus was enough for you. Recognizing he didn't just die for everybody else, he died for you. And aligning your life not just with Jesus as Savior, but Jesus as Lord. Calling the shots from here forward. If you're here today and you're ready to take that journey, as we worship, as we move forward with this service, I invite you to surrender. If you want to talk with somebody, pray with somebody, I'll be standing over to your left at that side exit. Would love for you to experience what so many have experienced since the days of Abraham, and that is the transformation that comes from the grace of God being applied to your life. If that's a decision that you made years ago, initially, know that today is a fresh moment to step into it again and to say, God, just as you've been faithful and promised to never leave me or forsake me, I renew my faith in you today. So I invite you to stand and to join me as we worship, as we place our faith in God yet again, because he is faithful even when we are faithless. Heavenly Father,